Today's lesson is on properties of quadrilaterals, and most specifically, we're going to be learning about three particular quadrilaterals: the rhombus, the rectangle, and the square. And so what you're going to notice about the rhombus, rectangle, and square is that they're all parallelograms. Therefore, the first five properties are all the properties of parallelograms. They just have a few things that are a little bit more specific. So we're going to start with the rhombus, and the definition of a rhombus is a parallelogram, because they're all parallelograms, but this one has four congruent sides. So I'm going to go down to my rhombus figure that I have down here, and since it is a parallelogram with four congruent sides, what I'm going to do is mark all four of the sides with one little tick mark, because that tells me that all four of the sides are congruent. And the hard part is probably trying to remember all five of the properties of parallelograms and then doing a little bit more specific. There's three additional ones that are specific to a rhombus. So remember, these five are all parallelogram properties. So what are those properties? Opposite sides are parallel. Opposite sides are congruent. We have opposite angles that are congruent as well. We have, let's see, diagonals that bisect each other. So they cut each other in half. And the last one is the consecutive angles. Angles. Those all add up to 180 degrees. For example, this one and this one, they are sup, which means they add up to 180 degrees. So that means consecutive means in a row. Any two angles in a row add up to 180 degrees. So what's specific about the rhombus? Well, the definition is it has all four sides congruent. Okay, and there's two other things. One thing that's pretty cool is that the diagonals, when you draw them in, and we will in just a second, they're perpendicular. They form right angles. So let's draw those in. Since we already labeled all four sides congruent, I'm going to draw in those diagonals, and if you're pretty good at drawing straight lines, they should look to be pretty much right angles. They should look like they're perpendicular. And the last thing is that the diagonals bisect the angles. So we'll fill this in. And what does that mean? That means that this angle is equal to this one, and that means that this angle is equal to this one. So that angle is being cut in half. This angle equals this one. This angle equals this one. So those are the three new properties about a rhombus, and just keep in mind that the first five are the properties of a parallelogram. So now we're going to move down to the rectangle, and the rectangle is a shape that most of us probably recognize, and what makes a rectangle special is that it is another parallelogram, and it has four right angles. So I'm going to label those four right angles on my rectangle before we move any farther. So make sure you put all your boxes in the angles for the rectangle. And just like the rhombus, the first five properties are the exact same as what we just did for the rhombus, because a rectangle is a parallelogram as well. So again, we have opposite sides parallel, opposite sides congruent, opposite angles congruent. What else do we have? Diagonals bisect each other. So they cut each other in half. That's always true for all parallelograms. And what's the last one? The consecutive angles are sup, meaning any two angles in a row. So these top two add up to 180, these two on the right add up to 180, the bottom two add up to 180, and these two on the left add up to 180. And part of the rectangle definition was that all four angles are right, so I'm going to put all angles are right angles, or you can write 90 degrees if you prefer to write that. And the other thing is about the diagonals in a rectangle. The diagonals are actually equal in a rectangle. So I'm going to use diagonals congruent. So we already labeled our 90-degree angles. I'm going to try, it's a little bit harder on a rectangle, I'm going to try and draw in the diagonals. And the diagonals are congruent. There we go. Okay, so maybe you want to make a note to yourself up here since we have some extra space. Diagonals are the same length. Okay, and the last shape we're going to talk about for today is the square, and that's on the back side of your worksheet. And a square is basically a rectangle and a rhombus put together. It has every single property of both of those. So again, it's another parallelogram, and it has both parts, the rhombus and the rectangle, with 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. So basically it is a rhombus and a rectangle. So what we're going to do is we're going to label all 4 sides congruent. 1, 2, 3, 4, just like we did for the rhombus. And we're going to do the same thing we did for the rectangle. We labeled all the angles as 90 degrees, so we put our boxes in all 4 of the angles. And the properties, that's just a really long list that we're going to have to fill in. So just like we did earlier, the first 5 properties are the 5 properties of all parallelograms. And we should be able to write all 5 of them in our sleep by the time we're done with this worksheet. Opposite sides parallel. Opposite sides congruent. Opposite angles congruent. Oops, not opposite. I get writing too fast. The diagonals bisect each other, and the consecutive angles are sup. Those are the first 5 that we wrote for the rhombus and for the rectangle. And then we're going to take the other properties of the rhombus and the rectangle and list them down here. So remember the rhombus, it had all 4 sides congruent. So all sides congruent. The rectangle had all angles congruent. We have the diagonals congruent. We have the diagonals bisecting the angles, just like it did in the rhombus. And let's see, what are we missing? Diagonals are perpendicular. Remember, they form right angles. So I'm going to draw all those things in. Hopefully I'm going to draw in the diagonals like this. And I'm going to label my right angle. My diagonals are congruent. They still bisect the angle, so it cuts each 90-degree angle into 45. That's kind of cool to know. Since they're all 90 degrees, that means it cuts them all in half. All 4 angles equal, all 4 sides are equal, diagonals are perp, they bisect each other, and they're congruent. So a big list, and the order doesn't matter for the list. Sometimes if you have them memorized, you list them in the same order every time, but since it's just a list of all the properties, it doesn't really matter which order they go in. So now you have a list of all the properties of a rhombus, rectangle, and a square, so that you can match them up and know some of the cool things about all these different types of quadrilaterals.